In this video, I am going to run you through how to compile an HDR timelapse. In the previous quick tip where we showed you how to capture an HDR timelapse, we mentioned that we were going to compile it in Lightroom. However, although you can convert multiple images into a single high dynamic range DNG file, there is simply no way to do this as a batch process for timelapses. So rather than showing you how to click buttons over and over again in Lightroom, I will show you how to easily compile an HDR timelapse within DaVinci Resolve. It is free, faster than any other software, especially Lightroom, and way more powerful for certain tasks. First, split the images into 3 folders for each exposure bracket. To do this, I'm adjusting my Explorer window so that the pictures are organized into 3 columns. Make 3 raw folders for each set of images. I will also create 3 new folders called 1DNG, 2DNG and 3DNG. To prepare these images for import into DaVinci Resolve, I use Adobe DNG Converter, which is a free piece of software. This renames the images so that they can be recognized as an image sequence and converts them into DNG files. DNG is Adobe's open RAW format, which any RAW file can be converted into. This enables Resolve to load almost any RAW file. DNG files also function better within Resolve than the original RAW files. Navigate to the folder where the first set of RAW files are located. Then select the new output location in the first DNG folder. Give it a name and number with an underscore. As this is the first set, I will number and rename it 1. Set the beginning numbering to 0 and make sure that the 6-digit serial number is set. Convert the images and repeat this process for the other 2 folders. Change their number to 2 and 3 respectively. Now looking in each of these folders, there is a named image sequence ready for import. I will now open DaVinci Resolve and set up the project environment. In timeline format, set the resolution and frame rate you want to use. For input scaling, I like to use the scale full frame with crop, as this sets the timelapse to full screen. Finally, under color space transforms, set the color science to ACES CC and the ACES output device transform to sRGB. This changes the way Resolve deals with changes in exposure and functions and feels more like Lightroom. With the Media tab selected, import the 3 DNG sequences. With all 3 selected, under Clip Attributes, check that their frame rates match the sequence frame rate, which in my case they do. In the Edit tab, I'm going to add these 3 timelapses into the timeline, starting from the brightest at the bottom to the darkest at the top. Looking at the change in exposure difference, this middle clip is not necessary as the step between the adjacent exposures is very subtle, so I'm just going to delete this clip. Now there is a nice exposure step between these 2 clips. The Color tab is where I'm going to perform my exposure blending. I want to create an image which uses the unclipped highlights of the underexposed image and the clean shadows of the overexposed image to generate an image with a wider dynamic range and a lower noise threshold. Hide all of the timelines above the first clip and grab the still of the brightest clip so that the exposure can be used as a reference. Unhide the timelines and double-click the still. The still now works as a reference and can be wiped across frame. Here you can see the region of clipped highlights, which the underexposed image will replace. In the Camera Raw tab, I'm going to adjust the exposure to plus 1.333 stops, as this is the exposure difference between the 2 clips. This will need to change depending on your HDR's exposure brackets until the 2 shots match in exposure. I need to create a mask based on luminance that isolates the highlights of the darker image and reveals the shadows of the brighter image. With the darker image selected, add an alpha output node in the node graph and connect the alpha of this node to the output. Enable the wand tool so the mask can be previewed. In the qualifier tab, drag up the low until only the clipped highlights are being isolated and add a little low softness. You can now see that the different exposure levels are being separated between these two images. Jumping back into the Edit tab, I'm going to combine these two images into a single compound clip, which I can then grade. The clip can now be graded like any other RAW file. Although the interface is very different to Lightroom, Resolve has many of the same tools. Gain changes exposure, Gamma changes the midtones, and Lift adjusts the shadows. As well as the standard contrast, you can also adjust the contrast pivot point. Saturation and hue are also located here. On the second tab we have our white balance controls. However, it is best to set your white balance settings in the Camera Raw tab and use these for fine tuning. Midtone clarity is very similar to the clarity slider, and color boost functions just like vibrance, as well as shadows and highlights. Finally, you have your RGB curves just like in Lightroom. This is just touching the surface of what the extensive toolset Resolve has to offer, and playing around you can quickly create amazing results. For this time lapse, I'm going to apply a grade I created earlier. Cycling through my nodes, you can see the process I went through to create this look. To export this time lapse, jump across to the Deliver tab. For the format, I'll use QuickTime H.264 with the desired resolution and frame rate. With the clip set to go, I'll add it to the render queue and press render. If you have any questions about compiling HDR time-lapses, feel free to ask in the comments below. To learn how to capture an HDR time-lapse, you can follow the link in the description to our previous tutorial.